Our speaker today is a good friend who's been with us many times before, former National Park Service's interpretive ranger who's worked in a variety of fields, literally, volunteering in the Canadian Arctic, teaching night sky constellations in the Badlands of South Dakota, and guiding hikes in Oregon's Crater Lake National Park. In 2015, she launched flat hat exhibits to bring the national park ethos out to the broader world. She has served as the Kleinhans Music Hall archivist since creating the Hall's 75th anniversary exhibit in 2015. Please welcome Lauren Becker.
Should be okay. It's not working, so let me do this real quick. That should do it. In the late morning of September 12, 1939, Edward Letchworth stood in the rain gathering his thoughts. For the past 5 years, he and Kleinhans Music Hall Committee had worked to honor their late friends, Ed and Mary Kleinhans, by creating the couple's Temple of Music for the people of Buffalo. Excuse me. Now, as the ceremony to lay the cornerstone began, 100 of those Buffalonians stared back at him, waiting for him to speak. It should have been, it was really, a momentous, joyous occasion to celebrate this great gift of music. But 12 days earlier, Hitler had invaded Poland and started what soon became World War II. As Ed looked out across the worksite, he saw there, reflected in the puddles and mud, a deeper purpose for Kleinhans Music Hall. It was a gift even greater than its music. He said, "Walls half up, bricks and stones on the ground. It is a picture similar to those received from war-torn Europe, pictures of destruction, desolation, and death. But the picture before us typifies construction, fulfillment, life. May this symbolize the role our country is to play in the world, and may it symbolize the saving of civilization itself from the threat of annihilation." By the time Kleinhans Music Hall officially opened, only 1 year later, on October 12, 1940, the Nazis had taken Denmark, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Belgium, Norway, and, shockingly, France. Hundreds of thousands of Allied soldiers had raced to evacuate from Dunkirk. We've all seen that movie, right? And Britain itself was battling for its life. Even faraway Finland, home of the music hall's architects, Eliel and Eero Saarinen, had been attacked by the Soviet Union. That opening day, Letchworth again gathered his thoughts and looked out at an expectant crowd. But this time it was nearly 3,000 people packed into the brand new hall, looking forward to its first ever concert. As the bombs rained down on London for the 36th consecutive night, the eloquent Letchworth stood up and magnified the value of the Kleinhans gift. He said, Their vision could not have been realized at a more opportune time. In a world gone mad with mechanized brute force rampant, we need more than ever the ennobling influence of beauty and culture and things of the spirit if we are to remain sane human beings. Good morning, everyone. I hope you don't mind. I don't normally read to you as much as I'm going to read a little bit today, but I am here to share with you a remarkable story of a Kleinhans you probably don't really know a whole lot about. I imagine many of you have had the good fortune to go to Kleinhans, and you probably have some stories in your family history, maybe even generations of people who have gone to our wonderful music hall in Buffalo. But how many of you made the connection that since Kleinhans, our historic hall, opened in 1940, that means that for the first 5 years of Kleinhans' operation, the world was at war? I hadn't made that connection until I started doing all of the research for the exhibit for Kleinhans' 75th anniversary in 2015, which is hard to believe that's almost 10 years ago. But, pardon me, excuse me. When the editors of the Western New York Heritage magazine decided they wanted to do another story about Kleinhans, it had been many years since they had featured Kleinhans in the magazine, they came to me and they said, hey, do you have anything that you could talk about for the magazine? And I said, in fact, I do, because the exhibit that we made was really just about how Kleinhans came to be, the years up to opening hall. But we had never done much about what happened afterwards. So not only does the story of Kleinhans in World War II naturally come next in the story of Kleinhans Music Hall, but it's actually a much more meaningful and significant story than you might expect. And when I had been flipping through the archives, I found some things that really hit home to me and were very touching and moving, and I was really happy to be able to share that with more people. And speaking of sharing that with more people, the folks at the magazine were kind enough to send me with a box of free copies for you. So before you leave today, make sure you pick up a copy of the magazine. It's the cover. We even got the centerfold spread, which is really exciting. So what I'll be talking about today, some of it is in the magazine article, but of course a lot of it is extra. There's only so much you can fit in there, and you guys know me, you know I talk, and there's lots of information. So you get some bonus content today with the show and what we're going to talk about. So thank you for being here. We're going to dive into a side of Kleinhans that I suspect you didn't know, and hopefully that one that will stick with you from now on and going forward. So welcome. Nice to have you here. Kleinhans opened, like we said, on October 12th, 1940. I'm going to keep giving you that date so you can write it on your calendar when you get home and celebrate the opening, just like I always do. But at that point, the United States had not entered the war yet, right? The British had been fighting for about 2 years, pretty much on their own, but the Americans hadn't gone into the war, but people in Buffalo and around the country were very much engaged with it. For one, in Buffalo, just 7 days before the hall opened, they had already opened the new War Defense Council for the city and had started making plans for how to change things in the city when and if the war broke out here. And nationwide, we had started what really was the first peacetime draft already. So even though we weren't officially in the war, people were feeling it. And so when the opening program for the hall was announced, there was a little consternation. See if you can figure out why. Franco Artori and the BPO decided to play for opening night, October 12th, 1940, 3 wonderful pieces by the composers Bach, Beethoven, and Brahms. What might be the problem here? Any guesses? They're all German, right? So I want to introduce you next to one of my heroes that has come from researching Kleinhans Music Hall. Her name is very memorable. She is Winifred Eaton Corey, and she was the first director of the hall for the first 20 years, and she was not to be messed with. And people were calling and complaining as if it were her fault what the BPO decided to play. But she had a ready reply. She says, "Good music makes good neighbors. It makes all the world kin. We may not like what certain nations are manifesting outwardly at the moment, but music will show the innate goodness of a people." So Bach, Beethoven, and Brahms it is. And then a little over a year later, Japan bombed Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. So that attack was, you all remember the date, yes? December 7th, a day that will live in infamy. That was a Sunday. The planes started bombing on a beautiful sunny Sunday morning, December 7th, 1941. The next day, Monday, December 8th, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the president, went to Congress and they decided to declare war. The next day after that, Tuesday, December 9th, was actually scheduled to be a pretty big day for Kleinhans Music Hall. There was a traveling orchestra from a little town called Boston, and they were in town with their quite famous conductor. I loved your quote about between World War I and World War II, the conductor became a little more important. So Serge Koussevitzky was a legend already, and he was bringing the Boston Symphony Orchestra to town 2 days after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. They always sold out the hall, so you have 3,000 people in there, and right off the bat, things were a little different, obviously. And he turns and bids everybody in the audience to rise and sing the Star-Spangled Banner at the start of the concert, which we're accustomed to for ball games, but it's a little unusual for a concert. And then the concert proceeds as usual until 9:55. They stop the concert right in the middle, silent, you could hear a pin drop, and the audio engineer for Kleinhans Hall starts to relay the live feed of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's fireside chat to the 3,000 people in the room, and it sounded like this.
We are now in this war. We're all in it, all the way. Every single man, woman, and child is a partner in the most tremendous undertaking of our American history. We must share together the bad news and the good news, the defeats and the victories, the changing fortunes of war.
Can you imagine? One of the reasons I'm so grateful to be able to talk to you and tell you this story today is because though we'll be talking about a lot of fun things that happened at Kleinhans during the war, everything has this layer of seriousness and significance, this great weight to it. And we talk about how, you know, architecturally the design of Kleinhans is so masterful with these big beams, so you have the open hall and nothing interrupting your view. And those beams were designed to hold up this hall, but at this point, immediately, those beams of Kleinhans are going to need to carry a much greater weight than just the roof and supporting the music that the hall was designed for. This is the weight of the community and the community needs and this war and what this building is going to need to do for people for the next 5 years. I want to show you these pictures and tell you these stories because since I'm the one that always has this history stuff in my head as the archivist, when I'm walking around Kleinhans or sitting and listening to a concert or attending a program, I have all of these things in my head. So when I'm sitting in this hall, in these chairs, I'm hearing that speech, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, broadcast live to 3,000 people 2 days after Pearl Harbor was bombed, preparing everybody to be in war, not just the adults, but the children as well, and life was going to change forever. These are important things to hold in our minds and to remember that they happened, and it's one of the reasons why Kleinhans is important to us. So throughout the talk, I want you to start holding these images in your imagination so the next time you're there, you're also experiencing that with us. So after this happens, life changes, every aspect of life. It's impossible to overestimate how much life changes once the US gets into World War II. You've probably heard, and maybe every now and then see signs and remnants of how one of the things that everybody had to do was learn how to black out your windows so you didn't have any light coming through. So planes flying overhead, enemy planes weren't able to identify where the towns and cities were. Buffalo was very serious about this because Buffalo was considered a high likely target because of all of the aircraft plants and all of the war production that was happening here. We're also near a border. It's not hard to come over. And everybody was thinking, you know, if the Japanese can make it all the way across the Pacific to hit California, or sorry, to hit Hawaii, it's not that much further for them to hit the mainland. So blackouts were very serious, air raids were very serious. They would hold practice air raids to make sure everybody could do it well. But that was a little concerning. Winifred wanted to make sure that people didn't think that just because these changes were happening that we were going to stop shows at Kleinhans. And here she goes again in her typical badass way. We do not intend that there will be any blackouts of musical culture in this hall. There never was a time when morale needed bolstering more than today. Music must keep on, not in spite of war, but because of it. And from then on, she started to define Kleinhans as a large building dealing in morale-producing factors. You know, everybody kept talking about production and how important it was. Well, what is Kleinhans producing? Morale, and that was very important. I love these posters. So they went ahead and they installed blackout shades. You know, we're really lucky with the main hall of Kleinhans. Very much because of when it was designed and built, there are no windows in there because we had air conditioning by this time. So you didn't have to have windows in order to keep people comfortable in the room on warmer days. So we didn't have to worry about blackouts for the main hall, but they did black out the windows in the Mary Seton room, and the lobby, and the rehearsal room. This was pretty important because that meant that they could continue to hold events even during blackouts and the practice air raids, and once those were over, everything could continue on. So you'd be in the middle of a concert, a thing would kick in, and everybody would just kind of stop and wait for the drill to go, and then the concert would resume again. So that's not too bad, putting blackout shades on. There were more difficult changes that had to be made. Everything that was needed by the war effort was considered a priority thing that needed to be rationed for the general public so the bulk of supplies could be used for the military. And one of the things that was most coveted by the military was oil for fuel and gasoline. So a decree went out across the land that anybody who could convert an oil burning furnace or hot water heater or whatever to coal instead, so that oil could then be gathered and used for the fighting, that needed to happen. So Kleinhans has had two big oil burner furnaces. These are both of them. They still exist today. They're quite large, and to demonstrate for scale, I took this picture. So they're enormous. They're about the size of a train locomotive. They're still there. They're downstairs in our nice protected bomb shelter-like area at the basement of Kleinhans. So they were ordered to switch one of those over to coal. And the problem was it was difficult to find people to do this. It was also expensive. So Winifred and her can-do spirit rallied the Kleinhans engineers, and they made the conversion themselves. They had to create a whole special room for the coal. They had to put a chute in the ceiling so it could be delivered and dropped into this coal room. I had a chance to talk to a fellow whose dad was one of the guys whose job it was to shovel the coal into this burner. And because it was a different time, he had on a tie, and he had on actually decent clothes because he was an employee of Kleinhans Music Hall, and he's shoveling coal. So these sorts of changes started to happen. The rationing became a big deal, and at this point, we enter a pretty a saga that really deserves to be told on some 2-hour movie, maybe on Sunday night, and that is the story of Winifred versus the War Production Board. So Winifred, of course, was in charge of keeping Kleinhans going and the morale producing that needed to happen. Everything was rationed, like I said. Things needed to be used for the fight. So anything that they might use, you had to really nip and tuck, and everybody was always out trying to find stuff and collecting metals especially, and oil. Well, at one point, Winifred needed 11 feet of copper wire to fix the lighting board to control the lights on the main stage. 11 feet of copper wire was considered valuable. She had to petition the War Production Board to get permission for 11 feet of copper wire, and they would not give it to her. The problem was this was a weird wire. It was actually square wire instead of round, which I didn't even know you could make. And that meant they had to retool the factory to make square wire, which meant it would come offline and not be able to make the round wire for a while. So it wasn't just the fact that she needed the copper, but it would require resetting the factory and interrupting. They actually told her, go buy a new lighting board. You should use that. And she was furious. You want me to spend the city's money to buy an entire new lighting board? We never got the lighting board. She also needed vacuum tubes for the sound system. Nope. She also needed this thing called a pivot bolt, which is what this is. The archive is full of this great. Deep in the archive, I have a folder labeled priorities. That's all it says on it. If you saw a folder labeled priorities, what would you think that that was for? Right? So maybe your to-do list or a mission statement or your 5-year plan or something like that. The priorities was literally for the priorities board. So depending on what your priority number was, and there was a whole system, a hierarchy, you could get stuff or you couldn't. So Winifred was constantly trying to get the Kleinhans priority number elevated to a place where she could get what she needed. In this case, it's pivot bolts. Now, I think most of you have probably been to Kleinhans. You know those enormous doors as you go from the lobby into the Mary Seton room? They're 22.5 feet tall. They're just gorgeous. They're held in place by pivot bolts. And already one of them had failed and the door had fallen. Now, I don't think it fell to the ground. They weigh 1,000 pounds, so that I couldn't find any newspaper articles, because you know it would have made the news if one of the, I think it must have just fallen again. It never did get fixed throughout the years, because they would not give her the pivot bolts. It's just tragic. But once again, Winifred is Winifred, so she has to rally the troops. We here in Kleinhans Music Hall are faced with a much larger task this year, that of making this hall a center of diversion and hope. And we shall do everything in our power to see that this hall stands as a place where idealism of spirit and principles remain intact, even if the pivot bolts don't. So I want you to now think of Kleinhans Music Hall as a center for diversion and hope. So before the United States got into the war, we were still involved with raising funds and material and anything we could do to try to help Britain all by itself for 2 years almost against Germany. And this is from one of the huge events that happened at Kleinhans. This was a fundraiser called Bundles for Britain, and this was a refrain you heard a lot, people trying to collect clothing or bandages, anything they could to send over to help Britain, which was in the middle of first the Battle for Britain, which was this massive air campaign, the Royal Air Force over Britain. That's an incredible story to read about. And then, of course, right after that is when you start to get the Blitz, where Britain was bombed, London, bombing every night consistently for 87 out of 89 nights. Can you imagine? I mean, when we don't have sun for a few days, I start to get cranky. I can't imagine the toil that would take on a whole city, on a whole community. So this is an event to help raise funds and money for the show, and it was a big deal. And I think the best way to tell you what a big deal it was, if you'll forgive me for reading again, this is from the newspaper the next day describing this event at Kleinhans. And it wasn't just a big deal at Kleinhans. This, I don't know if you can read it, radio to carry Buffalo show to far corners, their voices on airwaves to spread city's fame. This show was such a big deal that not only was it broadcast over the airwaves in the United States and Canada, but it was broadcast around the world on shortwave radio. So troops anywhere that could get that signal were going to be listening to this. And this is what was happening. The most brilliant event Buffalo has seen in a number of years was the British War Relief Benefit Ball and Carnival of Stars, given last evening in Kleinhans Music Hall. As early as 9 o'clock, guests began thronging the music hall, and less than an hour later, parking one's automobile had become a serious problem. This is funny because if you've been to Kleinhans, you know parking is still a problem. And you might recognize me. I used to be one of the people helping you park your cars at Kleinhans, and people drive up. They think they're so clever complaining about parking, but they are not the first people to complain about parking. The full significance of the occasion, for which celebrities of national fame had been brought to town, was felt immediately upon entering the foyer decorated with groupings of American and English flags. Close your eyes and imagine what this description is telling you about the hall. The show, which began at 9:30 in the main auditorium, was presented against a background of grouped flags and to a capacity audience whose enthusiastic reception gave the lie to Buffalo's noted reputation as a difficult theater town. The stage program was only the beginning. Continuous dancing to the strains of two orchestras in the Mary Seton Kleinhans room was highlighted by a unique fashion show opened by Mayor Thomas Halling. Here, where boxes circled the room, the walls were decorated at spaced intervals with large gold wreaths and tied with red, white, and blue streamers. Crossed British and American flags and gold wreaths flanked the stage, which was dominated at the center back with a large crown topped by red, white, and blue draperies and centered with a large royal coat of arms. British war posters covered the walls of the downstairs cocktail lounge. Quite an event. Then, Kleinhans became popular as a place to do radio because the hall was wired for sound, which is one of the reasons why we needed those vacuum tubes. So a lot of radio shows happened here. You might be familiar with the radio station here, WBEN, which is still around. They did a really fun program every week called the Quiz of Two Cities, where they would bring village leaders or city leaders or mayors from around the region in and do this fun game show, which was really popular. You also hopefully recognize this woman here. Yes? Eleanor Roosevelt, the First Lady, came to Buffalo twice during this time period and spoke at Kleinhans twice on a couple different things. She was really great to have in town. She always kind of made the rounds of other organizations when she was nearby, but her favorite place to go was the airplane factories. She loved going to hit up Mr. Bell and have the personal tour of the factories and the production lines. They would come out, Curtis also, and they would just launch the planes off of a street just so she could watch these new planes go up and take off and all around. Really fun to see how she talks about how enamored she was with these airplane factories. Have you ever heard of the game show Truth or Consequences? So this was a huge deal. It was a radio show, but you also had a live audience. And this was a major fundraising event to try to get people to buy war bonds. This is how the country was funding a lot of the war, very expensive war. So they raised, with two shows, almost $800,000 in the 1940s with this Truth or Consequences broadcast live, these two shows from Buffalo in the Mary Seton room. And the reason they raised so much money is because to get a ticket, you had to buy war bonds. And the more war bonds you bought, the better seat you got. So this is a hugely popular event. And what's really neat, I don't know if you can see, hopefully, can you see the red laser? Right down here, if you've been in the Mary Seton room, this is one of the air grates, one of the vents. Designed by the Saarinen, and it's always really fun to see these wonderful historic photos. I love this expression, they're having so much fun. And to see these visual cues proving that it actually was in Mary Seton Hall, and how neat that was. Other stuff happening at Kleinhans. We typically think of it as a music place, right? A BPO. So many other kinds of events were happening there because it was a city place, a city building, a civic hall. Anybody could come and use it. So we have what I've started to call contract cards. So this is when Keith was talking about Sikorsky coming, this is what I was able to find from the club reserving Kleinhans for the Sikorsky event. But you'll notice that they show who's renting the hall, their address and phone, the season, the year, the date for the hall, which room they're using, the attendance, the purpose of the meeting, and the contact name. So up here we have the Curtis Wright and Cornell University Engineering Aid Program. And this card is saying that they're reserving the Livingston Rehearsal Hall every day for 3 months. And they're using it as a school room, basically, because they're bringing in young men to teach them how to be aeronautical engineers and airplane mechanics. Wouldn't have thought that was happening at Kleinhans, but it's a really good space, and so that's why they were reserving the hall. We have the Niagara Frontier Defense Committee reserving it. Again, every town and village and city was creating their own defense committees. This Erie County War Finance Committee, this is the group that booked, Here's the Truth or Consequences shows, the 2 NBC broadcasts. Total attendance, 5,800 people for the 2 shows. It's a big deal. Another thing that was happening at the hall was a special thing called an Army-Navy E ceremony. These were award ceremonies. E is for excellence. And because production was such a huge deal, they made sure to build up morale and to keep everybody excited and working around the clock. For the companies who were particularly productive and exceeding the numbers that they were needing from the military contracts they were getting, they would get these E awards. Now, I don't know if you, there's an adage that I came across while researching all of this. And it goes, World War II was won by Soviet soldiers. The Russians lost 20 million people in World War II, far more than we did or the British. It was won by British intelligence. Remember, they're the ones who figured out the Enigma codes. They were also really good at sending out decoy missions and confusing Hitler and causing Hitler to send his troops where they didn't need to be so we could land on the beaches of Normandy, for example. And it was won by American production. America produced 2/3 of all of the material for World War II, and that is things like tanks and planes and ships and guns and artillery and ammunition, food, all of the stuff to feed all of the soldiers and other. America was producing 2/3 of that for the entire war, and a lot of that was happening in Buffalo. So these companies were very, very important. This is kind of neat. It's really fun to find a picture in the archives when you can do some research on it and really see what's going on. So this is Vision is Vital to Victory. This happens to be the award ceremony for a company called Spencer Lens, and they made lenses and glass and optics. And so during these remarks, and this is also in the magazine, they talked about how they made things to help kill the enemy. So this would be the sights on rifles and tanks and airplanes, periscopes from submarines, things like that. And they also made things to help heal the Allies. So these are the microscopes and the binoculars that the soldiers were using to help out the Allies. I don't know if you can tell, but these signs on the edge, there's a star and a number 316. And it took me a while to figure out, to learn what that number refers to. Does anybody know? So when you see these flags with a star and a number at an event like this from World War II, that's referring to the number of employees who have enrolled to serve in the military. So Spencer Lens had 316 employees that had either been drafted or had enlisted and left the company to go fight in the war. So you can imagine the difficulty when you have all these massive production scale up for the war, but you're also losing employees. It was quite a challenging time. So good for Spencer Lens. A lot of times I have photos that I don't know what they are. I can't find anything to tell me what they are. And this is one of them, but I included it because it looks patriotic and kind of military, right? We got guys in uniform and flag. Look at that flag, though. Does something look a little weird about it? Sparse. That's a great way to put it. Few stars are missing, right? Why? There's 48 stars. What states are we missing here? Alaska and Hawaii. Well, this is interesting, right? Because that means that when Hawaii was bombed for Pearl Harbor, it wasn't even a state yet. And we don't often think about that. I had sort of forgotten about that, right? But that's interesting. If we had more time, I would describe the pit orchestra and how the front part of the stage, the whole front third of the stage is an elevator platform that can lower to the floor level. And so that's where I guess we did end up talking about it, didn't we? This is another fun event. This is what happens when you fill the Mary Seton room with as many tables and chairs as possible. I'm not exactly sure this event, but when you zoom in, Franklin Roosevelt is here. This might be Cleveland. I'm guessing it might be a meeting of the Democratic Committee or Democratic Party or something. I don't have a card for it. I don't have a date for it. But one of the things that this brings to mind, what I do have are cards from nearly every possible political stripe and different kind of political committee who would reserve the hall for some kind of event. This is another benefit of having a facility that was publicly owned. If you could pay the fee, you could come in and have your event. So I have records not only from the standard Democrat and Republican, we also have the Socialist Committee having meetings at Kleinhans, and we have the Communist Committee for Buffalo. Also, they actually sent a letter afterwards and thanking Winifred and the crew for being so nice to them while they were there. Winifred's like, yeah, no problem. You know what we do not have? We do not have any fascists. I've never seen any reference of any Nazi, which is saying something because at this time in history, most of the country was absolutely isolationist. They did a survey in '41 and found that 67% of the population wanted to be so isolationist, not even sending aid to Britain. Never mind, they just completely wanted nothing to do with it. Part of that was because World War I was such a tragic and tragedy. It just shocked everybody, and people were still swirling and whirling from that, and they didn't think that we need to be involved. That's a European war. What do we care? But we're learning now more that there was a pretty strong section of the American population that sympathized with the Germans. Many of them sympathized with the fascist viewpoint and worldview, and many of them just sort of sympathized with, well, they need more land. They get that, they understand. It's incredibly fascinating and terrifying, the similarities between that mindset and what we see now with the folks not too perturbed about Russia invading Ukraine. It's a very similar circumstance, right? And a lot of folks who wanted to send the aid over to England were doing so because they wanted England to deal with Germany, because we didn't want to deal with Germany. Very similar. But anyway, all these meetings happening at Kleinhans. This is what the room looks like when you have a banquet and you fill it up. This is the Bethlehem Steel Company. This photo is actually from 1946, so it's after the war. But I put this one in so you could see the people. The one that we have from the previous years were the empty room, and that's not as interesting. But they really packed them in. This photo I just put in because there's a Chevy on the stage. And I didn't get there with the elevator. How do you get a Chevy? So I don't know a year on this, but I did find another photo without the people showing the cars more clearly. Are there any car aficionados that can tell what model year these are so we could date this photo? I've not found anybody who, and I've not taken the time to research it. I know we're kind of a Chevy and a Ford city, right? They probably were made here, parts of them. Nobody? Rats. Okay, I'll keep looking. We also had lots of Girl Scout meetings happening here. Look at these beautiful faces. They're just, but really look at them, right? Some of them are happy, some of them are a little very serious, right? Which is a strange look because this is actually a photo of a party that was happening in the Mary Seton Room celebrating the anniversary of the Girl Scouts. So what's going on? This party had the misfortune of happening on Tuesday afternoon, December 9th, 1941. So this was the same day, a little bit later, the Boston Symphony was going to come in, and we're going to hear that same FDR speech. So everybody was not themselves at this point. This is just 2 days after Pearl Harbor, and who knows what's being said and what people are feeling. So again, fun times with this very serious undercurrent. This is a really, really fun event, and this is very much bonus content that we couldn't fit into the magazine, but check this out. So this is during the war. Obviously, we've entered the war years, and this is a special event at Kleinhans where we have the Fort Niagara Army Post Band. All right, so here's a nice blend of war and music coming together. And the band from the fort is going to come down and give a fun concert. And look, you can be escorted to your seat by Sky Soldiers to usher at band concert, Army paratroops to invade Buffalo with Niagara Band. These three Millers are all the fourth biller. They talk, Paul's brother was on furlough when the photo was taken, otherwise he'd be there. So this is a really fun event to raise money for soldiers who had been wounded or killed and had come, and the families that are left behind. And this is, talk about a fun thing with a serious thing lying beneath it, that already, even in the middle of the war, we were needing to do fundraising to help families who were not benefiting or were not getting sufficient benefits from the military with the loss or injury of their sons and daughters and husbands. But there's another thing that makes this event very special, and this is one more thing to read. As the Buffalo News put it, the other touch of drama for the night was the band itself. The audience, most of it, didn't know that the band was an unofficial one, an extracurricular group supplying its own instruments. These were, for the most part, fighting men, subject to call any day now. This dude right here is literally a boogie-woogie bugle boy, right? He was a soldier, he has his trumpet, he needs a band, so they put one together. For the most part, fighting men, subject to call any day. Thus, the music showing such a shine and such good core spirit and careful preparation was a gift of soldiers waiting to fight, not a concert by men who would serve out the war, tootling the inspirational strains of Sousa. In 3 weeks, the whole complexion of the band might change and fluctuate. It was music for music's sake, you see, probably never to be repeated by the same combination. The cornets may be in Africa 6 months hence, the drums in Australia. Wonderful fun times, morale building, diversion and hope amidst heartache and horrific possibilities that might just come down the way. Let's get back to the fun stuff. Dances, so many dances. So the Mary Seton Room is a perfect place to dance with that big, wide open wooden floor. Excuse me. And everybody took advantage of it, especially the large corporations who had so many employees and they knew they needed this diversion and a break and a way to get out. So we have all these different Curtiss-Wright and Bell aircraft were pretty much reserving the hall every weekend for years for these events. Curtiss-Wright Engineering Division, dance, dance, dance. Attendance, 677, 500, 800. Over here we have the Romulus Club, which is a local fundraising club. The Curtiss-Wright Corporation, look at these attendances, 2,000, 2,200 for movies, broadcasts, dances, entertainment. The Curtiss Commando Club made me kind of giggle a little bit until I remembered that there is a plane called the Commando. Right. Okay, but it's really fun. And talk about being in the building and imagining things that used to be there and being able to do that. You all know that my wife Leanne is a ballroom dance instructor. So every time I walk into the Mary Seton Room, this is what I see. Even if nothing else is in the room, that whole room fills with these wonderful dancers having a great time and the big band up on the stage with Glenn Miller going and everybody having a fantastic time. This is, just to give you an idea, there are different references in the archives that I can cross-reference to double check and make sure numbers are right and events actually happened. And this is another one of the tools, in addition I have to the contract cards. It's a date book, and so every page is a day, divided into 3 sections for morning, afternoon, and evening events, handwritten, who was booking what, when, for how long, and that kind of thing. And I want to draw your attention to a couple special things. This is Friday, November 26th of 43. And here is a group, the Scroll and Cross Club, and they have booked the hall from 10 to 2 a.m. 2 a.m., and this is the Mary Seton Room. And here's another one. Curtiss-Wright is coming through, and they're booking the hall from 10 p.m. to 3 in the morning. This is for the swing shift workers and the night shift workers. You have production around the clock. Everybody's lives, the timing of your life is messed up. So just like today, if you leave work and want to go to an event, what if you're getting off work at 2 or 3 in the morning, or maybe you're getting off a swing shift at 11? You're going to want something to go until 3 in the morning. So that's what's happening here. And then it gets a little bit more. You see this one in the morning from 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. And you think, okay, this is Bell aircraft, you can see. That's a little bit more reasonable, until you see who is reserving the room is a man named Louis Pepe. Louis Pepe was the band director for the Bell Swing Band. So they were having a dance at 9 in the morning on Saturday morning for the folks who had come in. These contract cards, you see, Louis Pepe, Louis Pepe, Louis Pepe. Every single line on these cards is for a dance in the Mary Seton Room, from 900 people to 300, 750, all the time. And just the 42-43 season, they had 163 dances at Kleinhans Music Hall, okay? Can you imagine how much fun that would have been, right? And you needed that kind of relief. This particular photo is really great. This is another one where we can see the doors of the lobby, so we know for sure that this photo is taken in Kleinhans. Keeping up with the bells, as in Bell Aircraft. So they had a club where the women would volunteer to come to these events and dance with the out-of-town soldiers. So the article says for this particular one, there were 50 out-of-town soldiers from the base had come in. So 50 Bells from Bell Aircraft came and were their dates for the night. So they had somebody to dance with and felt a little bit more welcome. This is the schedule for the November events, 1943. There were 38 events just in this 1 month of activity. You can see all the things we've been talking about, not only the BPO concerts, the Air Cadets, the Aircraft Seventh-day Adventists use the hall all the time for their services and events. Quiz of Two Cities, lots of sororities and college events. It was just, there's Louis Pepe again, the engineering division. And then just regular people booking the smaller rooms for their recitals. Lots of piano students, piano teachers coming in and using the hall for that. Over 32,000 people coming to these events just for that month of November of 1943. So this is all great, but imagine if you're a staff person and you're looking at your upcoming schedule for the month and you see, oh, great, we have events until 3 o'clock in the morning. That's a big challenge, right? Staffing was very difficult for Kleinhans to hold on to for all of the reasons we've been talking to up until this point. You know, this in the 40s, Buffalo was almost at its peak population, which was a little over 500,000 people by around 1950. Even still, with 500,000 people living in the city, they estimated they were 100,000 people short of the number of people they needed to properly staff and employ these massive production facilities, especially the airplane facilities, the Bethlehem Steel, so many different things. Buffalo was number 4 in the country for war contracts from the government during World War II. So how much money are we talking there? If you include subcontractors, so contracts and then subcontracts for those contracts, about $8 billion came into Buffalo during World War II, and that's in World War II money. So you know, you can do the inflation calculators online and see how much was this value here to try to get an idea of what that would be in today's money. It's a little tricky because inflation has been tricky for us lately, and it was also a little weird during World War II. But in all the different combinations I did, that $8 billion translates to at least $100 billion in today's money. Imagine the change that would happen in a city like Buffalo to have $100 billion come into the industries here. Massive, massive changes. They needed more workers, so a lot of influx coming in. Of course, a lot of soldiers going out to war. That was a problem. But if you're a skilled worker and you're working someplace like Kleinhans, which is producing an intangible thing like morale and hope and diversion, what do you bet you could make more money working someplace that produced tangible things? I mean, we couldn't even get 11 feet of copper wire, right? That's how low down the priorities were at Kleinhans. If you can actually make the wire and other things, you could get paid a lot better in other places. So the staff that stayed with Kleinhans, Winifred tried to get them bonuses and increases in their salary to hold on to them to keep the hall running. But they were there because they knew of this important intangible value they were adding to the effort. There were 2, however, who got pulled away from Kleinhans during the war years. As far as I can tell, there was only 1 person on staff, and we're not talking a very big staff, right? Maybe 20 people. 1 person got called away and drafted, and that was John Frederick Wright, Johnny Wright. He was a porter, and he got drafted. It was really fun trying to find out a little bit more about Johnny Wright. It turns out he was a musician. And that's why he wanted to work at Kleinhans, right? So he played the trumpet in the band at Lafayette High School. I love this photo. And so, you know, that's what you would do, wouldn't you? If you were a musician, you just graduated high school, where would you want to get a job? You're going to go to the music hall and get a job. And we even can find his registration card for the draft. He just made the cut. His birthday was March 10th, 1920. So he goes off. The other person we lost to the war effort was a woman named Alice Tierney Scanlon, and she was the director of publicity for the hall, a marketing genius. She's become a little bit of one of my heroes as well, because I've learned that a lot of the advertising and marketing information that was sent out in the early Kleinhans years was written by her, and it's very moving and wonderful, all the stuff in the opening night program, things like that. So she got called away, obviously not to go fight, but she was called away by the government to do marketing of a kind, information services for the government. So these two people are the reason why I wanted to delve into the story of World War II at Kleinhans, because when Alice, who was in South Carolina at the time, was called away, she found out that Johnny had been drafted. Winifred sent her a letter to let her know, and that prompted Alice to send Johnny a letter. And we have that letter in the archives. It's a carbon copy, like everything else people were typing, right? Y'all look like you remember typewriters. I learned on the typewriter, remember so that's everything. So we have the carbon copy, and she writes this letter to Johnny when she finds out he's going to war. She writes, "Dear Johnny, so you are going to be a soldier. I think you have a great deal to take away with you on your new adventure. You know, Johnny, we who have loved Kleinhans as our home, who have watched it rise up and grow, we can't have helped developing within ourselves some of the spirit of music which Kleinhans Music Hall represents in the city of Buffalo. Keep that music inside you, Johnny. It is the thing that makes everything else, living, loving, fighting, and even dying, worthwhile. All of us are here with you every step of the way. Don't forget us, because we shall never forget you." Happily, Johnny made it back. I do find him again in the employee records in the archives. Up and through the 50s, I lose track of him at a certain point, but he did make it back. But that was something that was so moving to think about, and how close these friends had become through this struggle. And you know, don't forget about us. We'll never forget about you. And that memory, kind of that we've started off talking, is another thing that makes this place so important. Because so many people have been good to Kleinhans and taken care of it over these years, it's very easy to see this hall exactly the way Johnny and Alice would have seen it. This is taken in 1940, and this was taken just last year in October. It almost is exactly the same. It's so easy to picture the people dancing and the flags on stage. It's so easy to imagine FDR's voice coming over the intercom, the PA system, saying, "We're going to go to war. We all got to come in it. We all have to work together." And here's the same room. Can you see the picture, people dancing? Because of the time when Kleinhans opened, so this is the early 40s, right? And it was being built in 38 and 39. Our man, Ed Letchworth, our eloquent Ed from the beginning of the talk, often heard from people that this was a waste of money or a misuse of money. How in the world can you possibly spend $1.3 million on a music hall, not only when there's a war coming and we should, but what else had we just come through in the 30s by this point? The Great Depression, right? So think of the other things that money could have been used for. But Ed was ready, and in his typical eloquent way, he explained, "There is ample precedent for keeping alive the things of the spirit during these terrible days. It is such things that endure long after war, and memories of war here shall pass away." And he was exactly right? The hall is still there. We forgot about the war. But we need to remember the war, and there are important reasons for that. When I was doing the research and trying to find more information about all those stats and what Buffalo was going through, I found a book by a researcher who had been working for the government and was hired afterwards to compile all the statistics and evaluate how the state of New York responded to World War II. And after doing all this research and seeing this huge success, really, of everybody chipping in for this massive effort, he wrote, "Community of spirit is a fundamental reality in time of war. But based on tragedy and fear, which human beings try to forget, its original vividness fades rapidly. The memory of intangibles is difficult to keep fresh." And that's bad, because if we forget that we came through these difficult times and what we did to do it, we forget that we can do that sort of stuff, right? We look back on these times and think they're incredible, impossible situations. How did they manage? Well, they were just like us. And they pulled together, that community of spirit came together, quite often gathering at Kleinhans, and they made it work. We've been talking a little bit about Britain tonight, so of course I had to throw in a a Winston Churchill quote because it's Winston Churchill, but also because he's so quotable. A nation that forgets its past has no future. We need to remember that we made it through these difficult times so we can know that we can do difficult things. Sometimes we forget that we can do difficult things. This is also a Winston Churchill quote. This is from a little bit later in the 50s when he's looking back. It took Britain a long time to recover from the devastation of the bombings and just the difficult, so many men lost during the war. And Churchill looks back and he says, "We have surmounted all of the perils and endured all of the agonies of the past. We shall provide against and thus prevail over the dangers and problems of the future. We did it before, we can do it again. All will be well. We have, I believe, within us the life strength and guiding light by which the tormented world around us may find the harbor of safety after a storm-beaten voyage." And that's what Kleinhans had been. Kleinhans during the war was a harbor of safety for people, not only just the morale, but literally of safety. It was a bomb shelter. You could come there and be safe and get your spirit uplifted with your community and your neighbors all around you. And of course, we have to leave with a good old Winifred quote. Hopefully your new hero. In these days of trials and sorrowing hearts and careworn nations, we need a refuge. Kleinhans Music Hall is open to all who, in their love of beauty, in their love of music, and in their love of life, care to avail themselves of its facilities. We, in our big boat, on the turbulent waves of the world. And I have to say that when I think of other boats and shelters and people doing great things in the community and standing up for the community spirit and the ideals that are important to us, what you guys do and the role that you play in the community and the caring and the work that you spread out there to keep that community spirit going, it certainly fits right in. So I hope that you find these kinds of stories and these images not only meaningful for when you're in Kleinhans and can imagine these times, but for every day that you have to stand up and do all these great things like they were doing during those turbulent times. And that's all I have. Thank you so much. I'm always here for questions. Don't forget to grab your magazine from the box on the way out. And thank you very much. Back to you.
Thanks, Lauren. I have one more short quote to leave you with, attributed to the Chinese philosopher Confucius. Confucius say, when music and courtesy are better understood and appreciated, there will be no war. Let us hope that is true someday. So we'll extinguish the chalice. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again. Thanks for coming today. Please join us for coffee and snacks and socializing in the lobby after we listen to Jenny play the postlude.